Hi, my name is Enrique Mendizabal. I'm director of Think Tanks, and I want to talk to you about understanding policy processes as a way of helping you think about the strategies that your think tank will pursue, and therefore the governance, management, financial, research strategies that you need to develop. We're going to do this by talking about a concept of policy blunders. Think tanks differentiate themselves from research organizations in that they have a stated aim to inform policy. They want to have an outcome beyond their research community. So everything they do in relation to their governance, their management, research agendas and methods, communication strategies, fundraising strategies, and even what and how they monitor and evaluate has to be focused on that objective. Of course, there isn't a single way to inform policy or their outcomes. Think tanks can bring about meaningful change through several alternatives and complementary pathways. For example, they can open a debate on an issue that requires a fresh look, or they can bring together multiple actors to facilitate and inform consensus, or they can also provide evidence to inform the design and implementation of policies. And they can raise their voice in opposition of policies that they consider to be in clear danger of failing to deliver their intended outcomes. One way of thinking about the role of think tanks can and should play is to spend more time exploring how policymaking happens in their own context. So if you understand this well, you may be able to identify a few entry points into the policymaking process. And this serves two purposes. First, as I have just mentioned, it can help to identify opportunities for think tanks to intervene. And second, it can also help to make recommendations about policymaking processes itself. And this is something that few think tanks do. They tend to focus a lot on the what, right? The what of education policy or health policy or fiscal policy, but they don't think too much about, or they don't focus their recommendations on how should policy be developed so that it's better or it has better outcomes all the time. So what are these policy blunders that I have referred to before? Now, our associate, Cristina Bacalso, explains this rather well.
So what happens, before we go into what a good policy looks like, what happens when policy goes spectacularly wrong? We can think of this perhaps in gradations. Not all policies are wrong in the same way or to the same degree. We have policy disappointments, for example. So, for example, a government that can take an action that perhaps produces outcomes that were smaller, slower, weaker, or costlier than what they had envisioned. This is perhaps not necessarily the kind of worst offense, but it is certainly a disappointment to the public policymakers there. It was simply a disappointment compared to what they had anticipated for that policy. We also can see that, of course, public policymaking is full of wrong judgment calls. We know that policy is made in conditions of extreme uncertainty, of limited evidence, and so sometimes simply with our own limitations of our own human capacities, we simply make the wrong judgment calls. And this often happens too in policymaking. However, on the very extreme end, we have this concept of policy blunders. And this is a concept that was thought up by Cruve and King in 2013. And by a policy blunder, they mean a case of government initiative to achieve one or more stated objectives, which not only fails to achieve those stated objectives, but in addition, wastes very large amounts of public money, and or causes widespread human distress, was also eventually abandoned or perhaps reversed, and importantly was also foreseeable. Here they call this a sin of omission, or sorry, a sin of commission, not a sin of omission, in the sense that we sometimes do run into instances where policies are simply so poorly designed, so poorly managed and implemented that anyone really could have seen from the start that there were so many decisions and so many critical decision points where we simply just did not make the right decision, and it caused quite a lot of waste, unfortunate distress, and also in the end had to be abandoned. So why do policy blunders happen? Well, to Cruve and King, they consider blunders to be the cause of both structural causes and behavioral causes. By structural causes, they mean poorly designed policymaking and delivery structures that are liable to produce or allow mistakes. So we simply have not set up the processes which would really allow that policy to thrive and to be successful. They also name behavioral causes, which they really point then to the people within the policymaking process. Either that those people have inadequate skills or they simply have engaged in delinquent behavior. This would be the ministers or other officials who are operating in this policymaking system. And so in this way, we also see that that can cause policy failure. So I just want to bring up a short case study here. And this is just a very brief overview, and I will point to where you can find more information about it afterwards online. But this case study, which Cruve and King bring up in their book, is about the 1991 UK Child Support Act. So this Support Act was about enforcing the requirement that all parents were liable to pay child support to their partners and to then, in effect, replace the court system that used to handle these cases. This had also led to the creation of a child support agency. However, after a decade of the act, since the act was enacted, it actually had appeared to make very little difference to the proportion of single mothers who had received child support. Many low-income mothers often actually did not even become better off. And even on top of the inefficacy of this program, there was a backlog of over 300,000 cases and over 3 billion sterling pounds in debt. And so here, Cruve and King, they define this particular policy as a policy blunder. Now, what are some of the causes that they attribute to this? Well, for structural causes, they pinpointed that there was a lack of deliberation in the design of the policy itself. The officials at the time did not have any direct experience or direct contact with the frontline workers who would be working in the welfare offices, who would actually be interacting with these families. So they had really no future process, they had no prospect in terms of how this policy in the future would be implemented. They also did not consult with various key stakeholders in the civil society who had key knowledge and also key interest in seeing such a policy succeed. For example, various NGOs in the child poverty lobby. King and Cruve also identify a behavioral disconnect or a behavioral cause. One of them is a cultural disconnect. We can just anecdotally tell from the composition of the members of parliament in the UK that they come from a particular social strata and social background, which likely, in all likelihood, had very little interaction with the segment of society who would be most affected by this policy. And so as a result, they attribute this lack of connection to them not really realizing that, for example, low-income people were often in casual or intermittent employment. And such a small detail, when you think about it, is actually what had caused a sort of a trickle effect in terms of the overwhelming administrative backlog. The lack of understanding of the realities of low-income people, which came from this cultural disconnect, as well as a lack of deliberation with civil society, caused them to forget or to have this lack of oversight about this aspect of design in the implementation. There was also an operational disconnect. They simply, those policymakers simply did not consult with the local tax offices or the local welfare benefit offices about the logistics of managing such a new child maintenance payment program. And so the inefficacy of it just simply grew over the years. So if you want to find out more information about it, here I will point you to this website here from the Center for Public Impact, like I had mentioned before. And this, the UK Child Support Act is actually one of their case studies. And I would really encourage you to take a look through all of their case studies, which are from various policies from around the world, where they evaluate and map the efficacy of that policy along their framework here of policy, legitimacy, and action.
That was an example from the UK. Now, bear in mind that the blunders described in the book by King and crew are not insignificant. They stack billions of pounds each, and their stories extend over years, sometimes even decades. I had a chance to look at these blunders in a developing country context as well. So here in Peru, where I live, I've been looking at some examples of these blunders, and we have identified a very long list of them. And these range from public works to new labor legislation to investments in technology. And of particular interest are a series of policies aimed at the most vulnerable and marginalized groups, precisely those groups that we tend to have less information about. The One Laptop Per Child program in Peru is one of my favorite examples. So in 2007, Peru bought 900,000 laptops. It was the second largest buyer of these laptops, only behind China. The cost of the project at the time was about $44 million, and this does not include the costs related to the negative consequences of the policy or the costs since, right? So the cost of the project and running the project since 2007-8, more or less. Now, what happened with the program? Why is this a blunder? So let me start with the results, the outcomes. And there's a long list of examples that can illustrate why this is a blunder. First, the laptops arrived late, right? The delivery of some of these laptops to remote rural schools did not happen until 2012. That's 5 years after the program started. The rural schools, which were intended to be the principal beneficiaries, they don't have electricity or access to the internet. So the laptops had to be adapted, ex post, of course, once they had bought them, and at an additional cost. The teachers who had been very poorly trained or not trained at all to use these laptops preferred not to use them as part of their teaching because they didn't know how to. And so, the laptops went unused. And this is, we should remember that most rural schools are multiple grade schools where a single teacher is overseeing the education of children in different ages at the same time. Few parents also allow their children to bring the laptops home, which would have helped in the education of the children at home, because they were concerned of their safety and the consequences of anything happening to the laptops. What happens if somebody steals a laptop or the laptop falls on the ground and it breaks? Who's responsible for this? They were afraid, and I think rightly so. Now, thousands of laptops stored away in some warehouse burned down at some point, and those that did not burn down are probably still there. And what about the educational outcomes, where most studies suggest that these were quite negligible? So for the investment involved, not just in money, but in terms of effort and time, and the disruption this caused on students and teachers and parents, the results have not been positive at all. Why did this happen? First, I should say something about the decision to buy laptops. This was rushed. So in April 2007, the director of education technology at the Ministry of Education in Peru traveled to Boston to learn more about the One Laptop Per Child program. And almost immediately, the ministry implemented a pilot project in a school in Lima, the capital city, even though the main beneficiaries were going to be rural schools in Peru. Then on the 30th of October, this is just a few months later, the ministry allocated additional funding to buy 900,000 laptops for students at the national level. Now, if we draw from the analysis from King and crew, we can consider some of the reasons or the factors that affect or inform or explain this blunder. First, spin. Right? Peru was emerging from an earthquake at the time that had devastated part of the southern coast, and the government was keen to be seen to be doing things. And since it had failed to respond to the emergency, it had to do something else. And the laptops program was a perfect opportunity to present itself as a modern and proactive state. Right? Peru's president made a commitment in a speech, and then policymakers had to deliver it. This is a case of policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. If any evidence was ever used. Another factor that explains what happened is what King and crew call this operational disconnect. So the analysis of the case shows that the people that were in charge of designing the policies or the program itself had very little or no interaction with the people that were in charge of delivering, the teachers, for instance. they had not been properly consulted. So they designed a program without taking into account the implementation needs that were necessary, that had to be addressed. There's another element, which is technical ignorance. So those buying the laptops did not really understand what they were buying. They did not really know the technology involved. And this is very typical in any technology-based programs or projects. There was also an absence of deliberation and debate. There was no debate at the time. The government had a majority in parliament, the media did not question the program, and even think tanks and researchers in the education field failed to raise their voice. Education experts only began to ask questions and speak up when the first studies and evaluations beginning to emerge, and that was a long time afterwards. And then finally, and this is one of my favorite explanations for these blunders, the cultural disconnect refers to the fact that the people designing the policies do not know or do not relate to those who they are trying to benefit. So in this case, they fail to consider the reality of rural schools, about their students and their parents. The people who were designing the one laptop per child program had probably, never been to a rural school, and if they had probably done a quick tour of the school rather than actually embed themselves in that reality. And so, as you explore the intricacies of think tanking, we want to encourage you to also explore the intricacies of policymaking in your own context. Right? It is easy to assume that policymaking is the same everywhere, or that successes and failures can be explained by a common practice everywhere in the world. But the reality is a lot more nuanced, and it's a lot more interesting, right? And this has implications, significant implications, on the work of think tanks. For instance, are you facing a lack of deliberation in policy discussions? Are you facing a policymaking elite with a few or no connections to the most vulnerable, to their needs and demands? Are you facing a disconnect with operational cadres? Are the policies being made by a small clique of decision makers and researchers influenced by groupthink? The answers to these questions, which will come from understanding how policymaking happens in reality, taking a very realist approach, have direct consequences on the strategies that a think tank should pursue. And every strategy will demand different resources, different competencies, different skills, and even different business models.